Guys, welcome back to Expanding the Zone. This is episode number 3. It's going to be a championship chain, and I'll get to that in just a second. First, I want to tell you how excited I am. I'm Shayne Combs, SVCSportZone.com. I'm here with my brother Matt again, and throughout our first 2 shows, we talked a little COVID-19, leadership through adversity, and then we talked a little cheating the other night. Some really funny feedback from that. On one side, Matt, maybe I need to be a little bit morally correct at the euchre table. Some other feedback was letting me know that maybe you just needed to toughen up a little bit at the euchre table, and if you're going to play with the big boys there.
Well, I mean, maybe both of those are true. I don't know.
But in all seriousness, episode 2 was a lot of fun with cheating, and there's really in the feedback a lot of fine line there, but between gamesmanship and crossing a line and so forth. So go check that out. Again, we're all over. If you're joining us here on YouTube, appreciate that. But we're all over the podcast sites on your phone there, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you're getting your podcasts, we're out there. So again, can't thank you enough for the feedback. Certainly want to get into episode 3 tonight, where we hope it's not our last dance this year, Matt, but as we promised in the get-go, the real sports world, whatever's going on at the time was going to drive our show, and we wanted to always see how we think it relates back to high school sports. And I tell you, I think we have a topic tonight based on what we've been watching with the Chicago Bulls and the great Sunday night TV here. We watched 2 last week. That's going to be a 5-week series now, where they're going to show 2 shows each week. And gosh, I know I've got a lot of thoughts about it. I'll ask you first, though. It just kind of made a lot of sense to make this our show number 3, didn't it?
Yeah, it's funny, if you'd asked us a week ago what our 3rd show is going to be, I think you and I had been kicking around some other ideas, and then as we watched this Last Dance, and with the sports world the way it is today, this is the main attraction, I guess. That along with the NFL draft this week, but on this Last Dance, when I started watching it as a fan, I all of a sudden snapped into coach mode a little bit, and I thought, man, this is like a case study on, at times, great leadership and at times completely dysfunctional leadership. And I know you and I talked about getting into this leadership topic tonight. I got to be honest with you, Shayne, I'm excited about it, but it worries me a little bit because you and I have talked on this show. We want to trim the fat. We want to get after it, get right to it. And when you're talking about leadership, that's a broad topic. So I know we're going to try to dial in a little bit. Because there's leadership stuff out there everywhere. I know we're going to try to tie it into high school. We're going to dial into some specifics, but I am excited about it. I think it could be a good discussion.
In that first week, I was looking at it such an entertainment value. Obviously, growing up, a big fan of Jordan, big fan of the Bulls, and I looked forward to kind of sitting down and just being entertained in a time where we don't really have live sports to watch. And it wasn't 15, 20 minutes in. It seemed like my coaching perspective came into play, my teaching perspective and leadership and so forth. And I thought maybe it's just me for a while, but then what was so funny is you and I talked the very next day, and 15, 20 minutes into our talk, it just made a lot of sense. And I just want to share my honest thoughts about a half hour into the first show, Matt, and kind of, dive into this, as you say, in terms of talking a lot of leadership. Being a language arts teacher of 20 years, I'm big into poetry, big into music, some different things, symbolism, so forth. So a lot of times that's how my mind works. And as I make an analogy to this, the title for show number 3, a championship chain, comes to my mind because I talked about chain of command on an earlier episode and so forth. And when I think of a chain, I think of all the things that a real strong chain does. You lock things up, you pull things, it holds things, and as long as that chain's strong, everything makes sense. But if you have a weak link, if the chain isn't taken care of properly, if it rusts out or whatever, after a while, it just isn't going to do its job. I guess when I throw that at you first, you kind of see where my mind was going in terms of, and we're going to talk about each of these stages, but from management to the coaching staff to the players, all the way at each step of an organization, in our case, a high school program, on how it has to kind of be strong and work as one.
Well, there's no question about it. I think what gets overlooked at all levels, and we're going to deal mostly with high school level with this show, obviously, is if, like you said, at every one of those levels, there has to be a commitment to success. And it's pretty obvious that the players have to be committed and the coach has to be committed. I think sometimes what goes unnoticed is that your athletic administration, your board of education, your superintendent, your principal, they all have to be committed as well in order for programs to be successful, for systems to work. All parts have to be operating smoothly. So, yeah, I think there's this real nice correlation here as we look at some of the things we learned through that show, that you can say, oh, wow, on a much smaller level, I see those at the high school level too.
Well, let's just dive right into it. I look at the top of the Bulls organization, and early in that document there, they were talking about Jerry Reinsdorf, an ownership, and you're talking about a guy that had a lot of Chicago roots, and he was he was an attorney, I believe, and just really hardcore. And from a business standpoint, looked at it as such. He also owner of the White Sox there. The White Sox were, they were okay. Tony La Russa was a manager back in those times. I think they made the playoffs in '83. They had some winning records in there. It was a decent product, but the Bulls were a mess. And he brought Jerry Krause on board, the general manager, and obviously, they had a vision. They get a great player in Jordan, and they're off and running. I guess what I would ask you in terms of from the high school standpoint, I immediately started thinking as a coach about 15, 20 minutes in, as I was listening to a lot of their interviews, and I was thinking, okay, superintendent. I was thinking board of education, maybe from a financial standpoint, your relationship with the treasurer, your relationship with your principal. Maybe it's booster program in terms of whatever size school you're at. Maybe you're even lucky enough to have like your specific sport booster. Like some people have a football boosters or a basketball boosters, and then obviously the athletic director and whatever staff they might have at a bigger school. At a smaller school, maybe many people, or excuse me, fewer people's wearing many hats. I guess what I would ask you, does that correlation make sense to you? And when you make that correlation, what is it from a coach's standpoint you want from those higher levels, or how much, from a basketball sense or from a football sense or a baseball sense, do you need to be on the same page in terms of philosophy with those people?
Well, I think it all starts at that upper level. I mean, just like at the professional level, the owner has to make a financial commitment at first, obviously, to buy the team, and then to put people in place. It's a little bit like at the high school level too, because the administration has to financially commit to those programs. I mean, if you look at the high school level, not everybody's working on equal dollars and cents budget here. I mean, there are schools that have several assistant coaches. There are schools that have cut assistant coaches. There are schools that really go out of their way to make the best hires they can for coaches. There's some that just settle. And I think that those things show up in successful programs. When you look at successful programs, you'll probably find at the high school level administrations that make all of those types of commitments, financial commitments to the program, making sure it's got everything it needs, personnel commitments in terms of coaches, and I think too, at the highest levels, the word that comes to mind, I think it's overlooked a lot of times, morale. I think morale is such a big piece to this, and obviously everybody has a little stake in that morale or a little responsibility for that. But I think that at that upper level, that higher administration, the morale really starts with them. It's awfully difficult for morale to be good at the team level, at the school level, if it doesn't start with the higher up administration at a school, if that makes sense to you, Shane. I think that if the morale's not good at that level, it leaks, it trickles down to some of those other areas.
Well, what if I were to say things like, facilities, uniforms, right, the ability to travel, not just, in season, preseason, summer stuff, is that along the lines of what you're talking about, or are some of those things sometimes as coaches used maybe as crutches or excuses, or do people look too far into those, or do you think there's something to that in terms of the morale, the connection between the decisions made at the top on down to what the coach is wanting to try to do in his or her program?
I think it's different for everybody. I mean, I think some coaches will use some coaches or some leaders in whatever field if not successful, may try to use certain things as an excuse as to why they weren't or whatever. But what I guess what I'm talking about more or less is a mindset where obviously the commitment has to be, but also when I talk about morale, I'm talking about the type of attitude where people want to be a part of what you're doing, whether you're a superintendent and you're way up here, or whether you're an assistant coach or a coach, whatever the case is. Can you get people as a leader wanting to do the work rather than being forced to do it? Example I'll give you, you're a baseball coach, Shane. If you say, hey, on Saturday, we're going to all meet down here at the field, it's preseason, we got to get some work done, we got to get some weeds pulled, we got to get some dirt moved. I expect everybody to be here. Now, if you're the type of leader that rules out of, just accountability and maybe some fear and some, hey, you be here, your players will probably show up and they'll put whatever time they have to put in to do what you've asked them to do. They won't do any more, any less. If you're the type of leader that convinces them that they want to be there to work on that field, like, hey, I get a chance to go work on our field today, and I'm going to make it the best field in our league. This is going to be awesome. We're doing this as a team. That's dynamic leadership. That's morale. You're helping them realize that they're going to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And I think, again, that starts at the top. You see it in schools all the time. I guarantee you the schools where teachers volunteer their time, where there's plenty of people volunteering for the boosters. There's plenty of people volunteer to chaperone dancers. There's plenty of people volunteer to work the gate, keep the clock. I guarantee you, if you look at their higher administration, it's a positive vibe. They have treated those teachers and those administrators right. And in turn, those people want to give back. Does that make sense? They want to give back.
Well, it makes total sense. And I think, when I'm listening to you say that, and I think of it, it's a tricky dynamic sometimes when you're in the adult in that middle spot, in terms of, say, a principal is trying to work with the higher administration and work with teachers, because, adults, have relationships and there's different contract things and there's different things. I think what's interesting about high school sports is, as a coach, I may be able to take care of a lot of those adult issues, and I always try to keep those completely out of the eyes of my kids. So like what you're talking about with doing the field, there might be a lot of financial things needed. There might be a lot of resources needed, a lot of material. But when I'm selling those to my kids, I'm just selling it to, hey, we have everything we would ever need here. It's just a matter of how much effort are we willing to put in. Same way with equipment, same way with whatever it might be. Hey, we have everything we would ever need to get better here. Are we willing to come put the time in and do that work together? And I guess that kind of comes over to the coaching aspect of that. When you look at the Bulls situation, a leader like Phil Jackson and some of the different dynamics that he had as a leader, what jumps out at you as a couple of those traits that make him so special?
Well, a couple things jump out, and I think that are crucial for coaches. I mean, one, I think you have to develop the type of relationship with your players where publicly you have their back. I think that's the number one thing. Publicly you have their back. Privately, you're holding them accountable, and hopefully you've developed that relationship where we talked in our first episode, where we have standards, right? Sometimes, but when you look at the Scottie Pippen thing, for instance, if we're using this Last Dance example, he said that he completely supported Scottie Pippen's decision not to have the surgery till right before the season and miss part of the season. And he understood completely. Still to this day, that's what he says. Now, I've got to believe deep down he was frustrated with that a little bit. He wants to win. He knew that it made his job tougher. But he also knew for them to reach their very highest potential, they needed this player. And he needed to have this player's back and support him in this situation. So, one, I think coaches have to understand that. I think the other thing I think you have to do as a coach is you have to understand who you're leading, the platform you have. And I think I'll let you comment on this, Shane, but I think you talked about the managing of personalities a little bit when we talked pre-show some.
Well, you do. I think what happens is, I think you in leadership, you always hear you got to manage egos, you got to manage personality, you got to manage all these things. To me, you have to evaluate personalities. It really comes down to those relationship things. I heard Coach Maloney at Michigan one time, baseball coach, talk about at a clinic about how when it comes time to lead, there's always going to be times you have to get on somebody. You're going to have to challenge them. You're going to have to be, you have to be mean. You have to maybe be strict or stern or whatever it is. But that only works, he says, if it's like the bank account, if you've made your deposits. Have you made your deposits with them? Have you gotten to know them as people, your players as people? Do you care about their families? Do you care about them and their well-being? And if kids know that, then you're able to take those withdrawals when you need them. And I think that's true in all walks of leadership. And I think it's what you're talking about. If I follow you on morale, what makes people want to go do the extra is that belief in what they're a part of, that belief in who they're working for or with, maybe is the better word to use. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but I think you have to evaluate and you have to know each personality. As a coach, I may not be able to get on player A in the same way I can get on player B. It doesn't mean I don't hold them both accountable. It just means that if I'm going to get the very best out of them, which is my ultimate goal as a leader, I have to know them and know what makes them tick and know kind of how to talk to them, how to teach them, how do they learn best, how to challenge them, and so forth. There's times I walk out to the mound and I'm talking to high school pitchers right in the middle of heat of battle, and there's some of them I'm going to pump up and I'm going to do different things, and I'm going to try to really, motivate them in a positive way, where other guys, if I'm being honest, sometimes they just, need a good kick in the rear, right? That you need to go out there and just tell them, look, we got to attack hitters. We got to get people out or whatever. And that's all they need. So it's the evaluation of personalities. And I think that's what establishes that morale. Because when you say morale, to me, that's culture, right? I mean, we always talk about having a winning culture.
Yeah.
And I think morale has a lot to do with wanting to work to people. I would ask people this, we all go to work, are you happy to go to work? Are you excited to go to work? Or do you kind of like, oh, I got to go to practice, or, oh, I got to go teach class today, or I got to do this. That's morale. And if morale's not good, then I think culture becomes poor.
Do you have to go or do you get to go type of thing, right? And
yeah.
And my favorite definition of culture is Tim and Brian Kite Focus 3 podcast. If you've never listened to that, you got to. It's one of the best out there. But they talk about basically culture being how you truly believe and how you truly behave. Well, if you think about it, you're going to behave and believe a lot of things based on the morale, the feeling. Do you want to be a part of this organization that you're in? So you're right. Morale, I think, is a big part of that culture. And you said something basically, understanding your players as a coach. And I think that going back to the administration, I didn't touch a lot on the athletic director side, but I think as an AD, you have to understand your coaches as well. I think
absolutely.
The one thing I've learned over the years as an athletic director is every coach is different. And the funny thing is that the ones that at times might come across as high maintenance, like the ones that maybe send you that extra text at 10 o'clock at night that you don't really feel like looking at, or the ones that, oh man, they just turn over every stone. Can they just leave this alone? Those are also the ones that at the end of the day are probably really good too, because they're driven, and I think driven people,
they want to be good. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and let's face it, if you're driven, you're probably high maintenance at times. You just are, because driven people that don't accept mediocrity, it's not good enough for them just to say, well, that's good enough, we'll just leave it there. It's always got to be a little bit better. And so you come across sometimes as sort of a high maintenance individual, or somebody that's like, but really you're driven, you're good at what you do. And I think as an AD or as anybody in administration, you have to think and say, well, which would I rather have? Do I want this person who always goes the extra miles, and at times maybe I have to hone in a little bit, or do I want someone who's just lazy and only does the bare minimum? And for me, I know that answer. I want someone that's going to work as hard as they can work at their job, even if at times, like I said, that they're a little over the top with it.
I have to ask you about this with coaching staff. We were at Phil Jackson there, and when you look through the incredible, 15, 16-year run where Phil Jackson wins 9 championships, right there along the way with him was Tex Winters. And I have to ask you about coaching staff. Tex Winters was a guy that incredible design, spent 3 decades in college basketball, came to the NBA, obviously gets a lot of credit with the triangle offense and so forth, but he's right there with Phil Jackson, obviously coaching some incredible talent, and he was there. The first thing I would ask you is, what is it in an assistant in terms of putting together this championship chain that one makes the assistant so special? What is it that you need out of your assistant? What is it, because I think I've seen a lot of different personalities. I've seen a lot of different partnerships work. And again, that tells me that there has to be something to the word morale and to the word driven that you're using there that makes sense in this head coach and assistant coach partnership.
Well, I'll tell you the first thing that I think is crucial to this, okay? And this gets overlooked all the time, because I think one of the mistakes high school coaches make is they model themselves after college coaches. That can be good at times, but we're talking apples and oranges here between a high school coach and a college coach. Whether it be your X's and O's, you're probably not going to be able to do the same thing college coaches do. Whether it be the way you organize your talent, one can recruit, one usually can't at the high school level. But with the coaches, the same way. I'll hear high school coaches say things like this: I have an assistant, he's worked for me for years, or she's worked for me. And I always cringe a little bit, because at the high school level, they're not working for you. And if you're a head coach and you think that, you've got to take a step back. They're working with you, because here's the deal: they're not making enough money. They're not setting themselves up financially with this job. It's a side gig. It's a side hustle. It's not their main job. If I'm coaching defensive backs at Ohio State and I'm making $350,000 or $400,000 a year, I'm working for Urban Meyer. Okay. If you're coaching Benton County basketball and you're making $2,500 a year to be an assistant coach, you're working with Matt Coles. You're not working for him. Okay. So I think the first thing is, a head coach, we've got to understand that. But then after that, I think the assistant coach has to understand too that there's a certain loyalty, obviously, that's required, and all those things, and they've got to still put the work in and want to do the job. But I think you see these head coaches and assistant coaches, and I've been fortunate enough to have this. Now my assistant coach has been with me, I think, right around 9 years now, and in my 20-some years, I've only had a small amount of assistant coaches, and I'd like to think that's because of the friendship we develop and all that. And you'll see that at some other schools. I think anytime you see those long-term relationships between head coach and assistant, there's that understanding. The head coach isn't looking, saying, hey, I'm your boss, you're my employee. It's more of a relationship than that. And that assistant coach understands that, hey, I'm not always going to agree with you, but I'm going to have your back. And I think when those two things happen, you have that.
I just had this discussion with someone the other day, and I know for me, in order for the true, at least at the high school level, the true relationship between head coach and assistant coach is friendship. So I guess I would ask you, do you feel like a head coach and an assistant coach have to be friends, away from the sport? Because I look at it as some people will tell me, Shayne, the teammates, they don't have to like each other, but they have to play together. And I'll kind of cringe at that, because I'll say, I don't know that works. To me, the very best teams I've ever been a part of, be it a player, be it a coach, whatever my role may be, there's been great friendships and a great bond that come together on and off the field or court or whatever it may be. But there's also that same value, because I don't know that you truly get that trust if you don't have that friendship and that bond. So I guess I feel really strongly about that. I guess the question to you, can it work if two coaches are not quote unquote friends away from the job?
Well, I mean, I think that they have to have some level of friendship. I'm sure not every assistant coach, head coach are like best friends to where they, go out with each other and their wives every weekend or whatever. But I mean, there has to be a certain level of friendship there. in my mind. You're spending so much time together, and it's such a competitive, tough environment, you know. And I think I would go back to the thing you said about the players. I don't buy that at the high school level at all. I think sometimes maybe at the professional level, players can just be professional and say, hey, I don't really like this guy, but I'm going to be his teammate. But even then, even at the professional level, when you're getting paid obscene amounts of money to be professional, it usually doesn't work, does it? I mean, normally something breaks down, especially if there's a true dislike. At the high school level, if kids don't like each other, and not every kid on the team is going to be best friends. You got 12, 14 kids, whatever you have in your team in basketball, for instance. But if there's not a certain mutual respect and friendship there, there's not enough maturity to overcome that. You understand what I'm saying? There's not enough maturity.
Well, I would even
level.
argue that even with adults, there's not always the maturity to
That's what I
overcome.
mean.
Because I look at it as this, you know, when I, you know, right now, obviously we're spending a lot of time at home, and maybe my wife wishes this would all end and I'd go back to school and practice. But like, it's one of those things that, you know, I show up to work, I'm going to different meetings, and then I'm teaching and I'm working with these different people, or I'm coaching. The amount of hours you spend together, I'm not saying you're not professional and you're not going to, you know, meet the requirements. I'm just saying in terms of the word that you used earlier, morale, I just have a hard time believing that if people are not in the proper frame of mind, do not have that same passion and spirit, I just don't know that you can be. I'm not saying you can't meet some requirements and have a school year or have a sports season or whatever. I just question if this championship chain that we're referencing tonight can be top to bottom strong enough to do its job.
No, I don't think it can, and I don't think you reach your full potential. Look, I've never been a part of a good team, organization, whatever, where where most of the group of people just didn't like each other. It just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. And I think that, like you said, you might be able to do an acceptable job, maybe, and I would say that would even be a stretch, but you're not reaching your full potential without some mutual care and concern for each other, some level of that.
Hey, another thing I couldn't help but think about coaching wise during the show, former players becoming coaches. I know Bill Cartwright, who was a part of the first three-peat there in the first run, and then, you know, later on becomes an assistant to Phil Jackson. It got me thinking about former players coaching. And I know just now, as I look out around our area, I have several former players coaching, and I've been lucky enough to coach with some of those people. And it's a neat experience. Now, some people will say when they're too young, maybe they're too socially connected. You have to be careful there at the beginning of their career. Obviously, as they become older, negatives, positives, former players coaching for you. Where do you kind of stand on that?
Way more positives than negative. In fact, I think you can use what you just said to an advantage. You know, as I'm getting old and senile, I'm sure, in my players' eyes, if you have some young blood in there that they can look at and say, you know, it's nice. When I first started coaching, I could play open gym and still win. I can't go do that anymore. I get young guys in there now. They can earn those players' respect by going out there and competing against them in open gym, by lacing them up in practice every now and then. You can use that to your advantage. And I think too, former players, especially, you know, I assume you mean players that have played under the coach in the past.
Right.
They understand completely what that coach expects too, and those relationships have been formed. It makes me think of one of the quotes that was in the show the other night, Shayne, that where Michael Jordan said he had fought with his brother all the time. Do you remember this quote?
Absolutely. Talking about fighting with someone you love. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you do that, it like ignites something inside of you. Well, if you think about it, that coach player relationship at times where it gets tense or whatever, it ignites something in both parties. And down the road, that player becomes a coach, understands what that coach is going through, and it forms a relationship. You know, I started coaching under my high school coach. A lot of people do that. And it's those battles that you've went through together that strengthen that bond we're talking about that's so necessary.
Well, it's funny you said that. I actually had written it down in my notes. It was so powerful to me. The passion for winning. It says, when you come to blows with someone you absolutely love, that's igniting every fire within you.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about is not that we promote it, but a lot of times this kind of even leads me into my next step here. You know, we've come from the top, we've come to the coaching staff, and now we come down to the rosters. In that heat of battle, in that practice setting, and a lot of different things, you know, you'll have different times where you fight and where you different things. And I guess that goes back to the friendship aspect. I don't know that you can truly cross that line for even a minute with someone that you don't truly have some sort of connection with. Now, obviously, you know, I'm not saying it has to be the word love, but there has to be a bond or a connection of where you're in this together, or that's when those things become negative. You know, a lot of times I'll see two kids in practice almost come to blows, and you know, obviously I won't condone it and I'll break it up, but at the same time I understand it's almost truly like two sisters getting in a fight or two brothers getting in a fight or whatever it may be, because you know, you understand the passion and the connection and how much they want to push one another and compete. And I know you've coached kids like that, that it could just be open gym to the point where, you know, they might argue about the score or whatever, yeah, you fouled me or whatever it might be. And at times it might seem childish to someone from the outside looking in, but there truly is a passion there that ignites that fire and that drive that becomes contagious across an entire roster, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to that last part of this chain in terms of I don't want to say last, but as you work your way down to the team, to the players themselves, Shayne, and we start talking about, to me, this is the most interesting leadership dynamic of all of them. It always has been, because as a coach, the one thing we all want more than anything else is a player-led team. I mean, I heard Tom Izzo one time say there's nothing more powerful than a player-led team, but it's so hard at the high school level nowadays to get that. It really is. And I don't know whether it's, you could probably come up with, I'm going to sound like the old guy here, but you could probably come up with this. These kids grow up sort of in a texting digital world where their communication really isn't verbal a lot of times, like it was maybe when we were growing up. So they don't learn maybe to communicate verbally with each other. And sometimes that, I think that hurts the vocal leadership. I mean, we saw the vocal leadership out of Jordan, right? Good, whether you agree with it or not in this show. I mean, he wasn't holding back in practice. He was borderline combatant at times with his words, right? But I think it pretty much showed who was the alpha dog. And let's face it, I think, I don't know how you feel about this. I feel like if you're going to be the vocal leader on a team, you're probably going to be one of the best players too. It's awfully difficult for a role player, even though they can be great. I've had some role players be great nonverbal leaders where they show up early, stay late, do it right in the classroom, set the example. But in terms of speaking up and really being as vocal as you saw Jordan being on The Last Dance, you got to be one of the best players to have that level of respect of your teammates.
Well, you do. But if I were going to bring it to the high school, the only thing I would do to tweak what you just said is I would say you have to be the best at what you do. So like, here's what I mean by that. Here's what I always challenge our kids is do it yourself first, and then you can go and demand it of others. And what I mean by that is, you can't get on that 8th, 9th starter we need on our baseball team because he's struggling to pass if you're sitting there and you have like a C- average. You see what I'm saying? Like,
right.
If you have that kid that's a straight A student, A, B student, and they get on them in the correct way, it's hard. It's the same way the kid that wins every sprint, or the kid that just maximizes the effort and the hustle and if he or she looks their teammates and says, hey, come on guys, pick it up, let's go. Well, it's hard to look at them and say anything back to them because they're the ones working harder than anyone else. So I think where I agree with you is you have to be the best at what it is you're demanding in return. But I think it also goes back to that investment, that morale that you're talking about in terms of evaluating the personality of your teammates. One of my role models growing up was a teammate of yours where I was kind of young. For a lot of our local listeners will remember the name D.B. Mullins. it was so cool for me to watch DB, because DB was one of those leaders that he understood there were certain things that might motivate the team or different things. And he basically just played right along with it because he knew how much it was going. A lot of times he'd look over at me and wink or whatever it might be, and he was ready to move forward and play. But it amazed me how he had such an understanding. And it also amazed me, you're talking about a guy who probably didn't score 100 points in his career, how he had the respect of someone like you or some of the other best players to point them in the right direction on the court and to do those different things. So I guess I would ask you, did that not come from a friendship that went far beyond the basketball court? And did that not come from a year or two of relationship and bonding and different things that kind of goes back to the point that I was talking about earlier about how true, really, really good teams can't have that true success unless they have those true relationships?
Yeah, no, there's no question. Those relationships at the end of the day, and you said it early when you talked about coaches being able to get on players by making, I think you called it a deposit.
Right. Make deposits in order to take a withdrawal when needed.
Right. Those are relationships you're talking about. You build those relationships. And because of that, you're able to be brutally honest with people. Think about this. Think about if you've ever had successful relationships, successful organizations, the one things you've been able to do is be brutally honest within those relationships or those teams. There's never been, well, maybe I can't mention this or I shouldn't bring this up. Everything's out there. You question. Think whether it be a marriage, whether it be a friendship, whether it be a team, there has to be that. We talk in our coaches meetings every year about question everything. In our postseason coaches meetings, I tell my assistant coaches, question it all. Why do we do pregame the way we do? Why do we ride the bus the way we do? Why do we dress this way to games? I don't care how little it seems. Ask the question why. And if the answer is, well, that's just the way we've always done it, then let's take another look at it, because that's not good enough. If the answer is, we've done it that way because we truly think that's the best way to do it, then that's what we're looking for. But you have to, I think you have to offer that honesty, but you better be willing to accept that honesty too. And that's where those relationships, like you say, come into play.
Well, in the analogy of the championship chain I talk about, think of an actual chain. You know what I mean? If you want the chain to stay strong and do what all those things it needs to do, you need to protect it. And it's one of those things that, when you truly take care of it, like you said, you're asking, why do we do this? Why do we do that? But don't you think it also comes back to, as a leader, it's okay sometimes to take a little bit of opportunity to simply tell someone, hey, I appreciate that you're doing this, and this. I need you to do it more. But at the same time, hey, I need to do this better. You need to do this better, and so forth. And you need to have those honest conversations. I think the days of the coaches meeting have maybe gone away too much. I think we use email a lot. I think we use texting a lot. I think I still think there's a place for the 15 minutes before practice, the 15 minutes after practice. I'm still very old school in that way. Do you find yourself sometimes trying to really get that opportunity to spend that time and to talk to your coaches before, after practice in person, rather than going your separate ways, similar to the way you'd hope your kids do in the locker room maybe?
Yeah, there's just no substitute for face-to-face communication. It's still needed. I don't care how many different ways, we can do these things. You and I are sitting at two different locations right now because we have to be. If this were a situation were different, you and I'd probably be sitting in the same room right now, right? Just because it makes communication easier, and it makes it more efficient, better. But yeah, no, I agree 100%. Those lines of communication, true verbal communication, always have to be open.
Yeah, you mentioned a second ago, going back to when the best players are the vocal ones, and kind of setting the pace or the example of whatever it might be on a team. I wanted to take you further down the roster. So like when I look at some of these Bulls teams, obviously we know about Jordan, we know about Pippen. In the early runs, we know the Horace Grants and the Cartwrights and those guys. We later know about Rodman and Kukoc and those types of players. There's no question about those. But I'm talking all the way down from, the old Bulls fans will know some of the names, Scott Williams or Trent Tucker, or, Randy Brown or Judd Bushel or whatever. I'm talking about top to bottom on the roster. You're not going to have those leaders. And sometimes being a follower is really, really difficult. And what I see at the teaching middle school for 20 years, I start to see personalities start to form a lot when I work with kids from the 6th, 7th, and then 8th grade before we pass them on to the high school. And it's kind of a really neat thing to watch, but it's also a very concerning thing to watch sometimes, because you see some kids that they're just not going to have some of those leadership skills. It's not going to be their personality. So as I'm learning their personality, I'll be honest, the second half of my career, as I've really studied leadership, I've really started to try to talk to them about making great decisions, and understanding that if leadership is not in your personality, let's be real careful about what decisions you're making and who you're following. Do you see a connection there in sports in terms of where maybe we don't always go about this whole leadership and the following the correct way?
Well, no, I think we do a miserable job as a whole of teaching followers. I mean, we have to
Mm.
teach followers. We think about it. Everything we do in education and coaching, it's always centered around teaching leaders. You probably can't find a school mission statement that doesn't involve something along the lines of tomorrow's leaders, or we're developing leaders. You know what I mean? Which
Right.
is great. I mean, no, it's great. We have to do that. But my point is, we don't teach people how to be followers. Not everybody's going to be a leader. And part of being a great leader is understanding your platform, understanding your audience, and understanding or teaching people, I should say, how to be quality followers. And if you have a roster as a coach, you're going to have a couple vocal leaders. You're going to have a couple more people that maybe lead in other ways, but you're going to have a group of kids who it's not their personality to lead at all. But what you want them to do is to be a loyal, solid follower to your leaders. And that way you can continue to teach your leaders, coach your leaders, and those other kids can follow the right way and support their leader. Because think about it, if you're not in a leadership position, and even people like you and I, who I think by nature consider ourselves leaders, there's times where we have to play the role as follower, correct? There's times where we're in an organization, we're not the leader. We have to be the follower. And who has taught us the right way to follow? See, I think that is so crucial. We almost preach leadership to the point of making somebody who's a follower feel like a loser. I'm just being honest. I mean, you'll hear people say, "Hey, stop that, be a leader." Well, I get what they're saying, but we're almost sending the message that if you're not a leader, you're a loser. And that's not the way it is.
The better way to say is, hey, let's follow a better leader. Let's make a better decision.
Yeah. If you're not going to lead, follow the right way, follow the right people and the right person. And I think as a coach, that's one of the main things that we have to get better at, or as teachers or whatever, teaching followership, not just leadership. We have to teach people how to follow.
Hey, I want to read you another quote from the show. This came from Jerry Krause, the Bulls GM. He says, "Players and coaches alone do not win championships. Whole organizations do. One part can't win alone." And obviously that was the one he was misquoted on, as he was saying, and that caused a lot of controversy or so forth. But I just wanted to talk to you about this entire chain. If
Right.
there is a weak link, can you be successful?
I don't think you can reach your full potential, whatever that is. I think that you can still, depending on your talent at certain levels,
So like Michael Jordan talent can solve a lot of links.
Sure. A sports analogy. If you have LeBron or Jordan or somebody like that, maybe they overcome something like that. If you have a weak link in the McDonald's corporation, they're not shutting down tomorrow. You see what I mean? They're still going to reach a certain level of success. Now, if you have a bunch of weak links over the course of 10 or 20 years, maybe McDonald's takes a hit. Just using them as an example. There are certain organizations that are so talented or so powerful that a weak link's not going to maybe completely destroy, but I would argue that it still limits them in some capacity. But I think at the high school level, when we're talking about teams, athletic teams or organizations of any kind, I think it's very difficult on that small level, I think it's very difficult to be successful if any one of these links we've talked about is damaged too much.
Well, one thing I couldn't help but connect when I started thinking, okay, what's the difference between the high school championship chain compared to this as we're using the Bulls or a championship organization at the higher levels? And one had to be with in terms of, okay, community and fan base, maybe there's a correlation there that's a little bit different, but the one thing that's totally different is relationships with parents, and we're dealing with families, not just the player. And this might be an entire show in itself at some point in terms of coaches and relationships with parents and families and so forth. But I guess what I would ask you is, what connection with morale, with the word ego that we've talked about, leadership, following, those types of things, how do the parents fall into this puzzle? And I guess what I would ask you is a head coach, you kind of fall in the middle of this chain in a way. What's your role? What's the secret sauce, I guess, in terms of making that all work?
Well, probably the word we haven't talked about is communication. I think laying out the plan to everybody involved. I think as a coach, you have a responsibility to parents to help them understand your vision for your team and where you want to go with this, because parents are going to look at things through different lenses. You're going to have a parent of a kid who eats, drinks, sleeps the sport they're playing. Most likely that parent has spent money, time in the off season running kids to AAU, club volleyball, whatever the sport is, right? Putting in those extra hours. They're going to expect a coach to operate a certain way and to treat that sport with the utmost of importance. Now, on the other end of that roster, you're going to have a kid who just wants to be a part of the team, who wants to be a part of a school team, who's doing it socially. Their parents are going to view that a little differently. What do you mean you're having 2.5-hour practice tonight? What do you mean you got to come in Sunday for an afternoon walkthrough? You see, there's going to be a difference there where one parent's going to view it one way and another parent's going to view it another. So I think as a coach, before the season starts, the preseason parent meeting is crucial, I think, to lay a framework for what you expect. But now we start talking about that chain that you've been mentioning this whole show. Once that the coach has relayed that to the parents, but then the parents also know that the AD is in line with the coach, the principal's in line with the coach, the superintendent, board of education's in line with the coach. They all understand the goal. They all understand the process, I guess would be the right word, and we're all on the same page. To me, at the high school level especially, that's crucial. Because people who don't think parents are a part of this, and you are coaching the most important thing in their lives, their sons or their daughters, and you have to respect that as a coach. But then in turn, parents have to respect the coaches. They have to give that coach space and respect their job as well. If you know, those boundaries have to be there. But I think it's the coach's responsibility to lay that framework out.
You know, the thing that jumps out at me is in a day where AAU basketball, club volleyball, Legion baseball, travel softball, all these things are a lot bigger part. I get a little bit of what you're saying, because I think one of the hardest things to do at a smaller school setting. So for some of our small school coaches that are listening to us here, I look at it from a standpoint of, you may have one or two families that, man, they put an incredible amount of miles on the car, money, they travel, they do all these different things. Well, they then have to come back and coexist sometimes on a high school team where, as you just said in your example, I don't know if that's for me. You wanted me to commit this much and do those things. And so you're trying to blend all of those things together. And I think that's a really tricky thing. I think in a day of open enrollment and a lot of different things, I think it's very intriguing to people to eyeball what's out there. And I'll be honest, as someone who coaches at a small school for the last 2 decades, I kind of feel like it's a little bit of my challenge, a little bit of my job to be an ambassador for my program and what it is I'm trying to do. I guess I say all that to say this: where do you fall in the day of coaches in terms of social media? And I know we might be getting into some things with parents, social media things that might be a show in itself. But I guess when you're trying to bring this link together, and if we're saying community, and we're saying parents, and we're saying all these different people have to be there to form this strong chain, you know, what role do you see in social media in terms of what you're comfortable using it? Do you think coaches use it too much? Do you think they could use it more? Just what role?
I personally like social media, and I think you can really use it to benefit your program. I mean, just today we released a Benton County basketball YouTube page with where a couple former players and myself broke down a championship game from a few years ago. I think people are going to have a lot of fun with that. We use things like Facebook and Twitter to get announcements out there and whatnot, and I think it's great. I think that for the most part, I think the coaches who do use it the right way. I don't see a whole lot of things on there that make me scratch my head. You know, I think some coaches are less comfortable with it. I would say this: it's like anything else as a coach. You got to evolve, or the game just leaves you behind. And social media is just part of that. If you're not comfortable with it as a coach, find one of your assistants who is, and have them do it for you. Because to ignore it and just say, I don't need that. You know, it's just it's ignoring it. It's funny. It's like when the 3-point line came out. I remember coaches be like, "Oh, that 3-point line is not going to mean a thing. I ain't worried about that." You know, and they were in denial, right? And it's kind of like that with social media. It's here. It's got to be used. It's a part of these kids' lives every single day, and you got to get on that train or get left behind. I mean, I just think again, part of our job as coaches is to evolve, change with the times.
Well, here's the analogy I use, Matt. Tell me if you agree, disagree, or want to add something. I think one thing that we don't do a very good job of teaching kids how to deal with or manage stress. Sometimes we get in this make-believe world of where we're going to eliminate stress.
Sure.
You're going to eliminate stress. Well, I don't know that exists, right? You know what I mean? There's going to be, throughout every age and every step of life, you're going to have adversity and you're going to have different things that are stressful. Isn't it better to learn to manage your stress? The same way with social media. There's some coaches be like, just ignore it, or I don't want my kids on it. Well, that's just not reality. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's there. Kids are going to be on it. So to me, I use that same analogy of you better, one, teach kids how to properly use it and be aware of it in terms of what's out there. But then two, coaches better understand that that's an avenue of communication, that if you're wanting to communicate with today's players, if you're wanting to communicate with today's families, that it's certainly something you better understand. I guess I would say this in closing is, well, I want to ask you before I comment, if going into some of these upcoming shows on The Last Dance, obviously as sports fans, we're looking for really cool things right now. And this has come at the perfect time, because like you said, outside the NFL draft, we really haven't had anything sports other than, the throwback games and the different things and some of those replays. What is it that you would encourage people to pay attention to, other than just the entertainment value? What is it that you would encourage people to pay attention to in some of the upcoming episodes from a championship structure or just an overall leadership scope?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of them, and I would add this one more. I think pay a lot of attention to how quickly something can crumble when people worry too much about who gets the credit. I think that's a big one, and I think obviously most people believe that Jerry Krause felt like he didn't get enough credit, so I can tear this thing down and build it up again. Some people, people may. Scottie Pippen believed he didn't get enough credit because of how he got paid, which I tend to think he was very much underpaid. But again, it goes back to, am I getting enough credit? You see this in all sports. Shaq and Kobe, Belichick, Brady, this Bulls team. When people start getting really eaten up with who's getting the shine, then all of a sudden the organization starts to suffer a little bit. So I'm excited to watch it. I mean, obviously we know the story a little bit of the Bulls. So now we're just getting more of an inside look. I don't know that we're seeing things that absolutely shock us that we haven't heard of before, but we're seeing some personal conversations that we weren't privy to in the past. But I think as we watch this, I think we're going to start to notice that more and more, how egos start to maybe burn out, like those egos that make us driven and make us successful, all of a sudden start to burn out of control, start to get a little too big, and that's when the organization starts to suffer. And I think that happens at the high school level too, unfortunately.
Oh, I think that's huge at the high school level. And what's so neat about this is at the higher levels, you always think of contracts of being 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever they might be. Well, toward the end of this run, you're talking about very similar to a high school type contract or high school landscape of, it was almost like 1 year at a time, 1 year at a time. And, Jordan made the comment after the 97 championship, I believe it was, that we've earned the right to defend this a year at a time until someone beats us. And I guess you and I are seeing this a little bit of the same way, Matt. I'll kind of say it this way, is I want people to pay attention to the relationships, right, and watch how the relationships that were once as strong as ever kind of kept the chain together. That not all the links got along from start to finish. Okay. Right. But there were some of the most important links were as strong as ever. And then toward the end, some of these relationships start to break down. And when that morale starts to break down, people start to maybe not feel as appreciated. People maybe start to feel a little bit too much of a burden, so forth. It's crazy to think about how something this dominant in the big time dynasty ended without losing, if that makes sense. Is it fair to call the Bulls' end of a dynasty kind of self-destruction?
I mean, yeah, I think it is. And it usually doesn't end good like that either. I mean, I think they're an exception more than they are the rule. I mean, we normally see it go south with, you can remember the scene of LeBron walking out of the Boston Garden, taking his jersey off, throwing it down when he left Cleveland the first time, right? It normally doesn't end well. In this case, I guess it didn't end well necessarily, but it ended on a winning note because of that talent and there's, being able to figure it out. But yeah, I think that self-destruct is, when I watch that, self-destruction is a term that comes to mind. Yes.
Well, I this is the last thing in my notes, and I'll give you a final shot, and I'll give some contact information. We'll get out of here this week. But a coaching mentor of mine, Hall of Fame high school baseball coach Don Neff, I remember him constantly, some of his quotes and some of his different things, he talks to me every day I coach. He'd always be like, if it is to be, it's up to me. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's one of those that's, there's no limit to what we can achieve if no one cares who gets the credit. And he's constantly saying those types of things to people, and all of that stuff applies. And I remember I remember him always saying, I finally one time had the courage when I was a little bit older to walk up to him and say, Coach Neff, does it bother you that, the kids mock you and the kids, and he interrupts me and he's like, no, Shayne, if they're mocking you, that means they're listening. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's one of those things but those relationships and those concepts and those foundation pieces are what always stuck with me with some of the best coaches that I've had the privilege of being around. And unfortunately, at the high school level, I'm not going to sit here and give a lot of examples and so forth, but at the high school level, things that I see that start to break down usually break down with relationship issues. So I think it's an appreciation for people on that chain with you. I would say I've never seen a particular chain with one link do all those things I described at the start of the show. It's got to be a chain. It's got to be my link, your link. And yeah, it takes some of the best talent or the most successful people to do that. But I mean, that chain top to bottom is important. So, Matt, this has been incredible. I've really enjoyed it. Maybe a final thought on the topic here. I'll give some contact information and get us out of here.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you just said, top to bottom and bottom to top. I think it's got to be a mutual respect both ways. We talk about administration supporting coaches. Coaches have to support their administration. It goes both ways. I mean, that respect has to be mutual. That chain has to be strong in each direction. And so, no, I know we've taken a broad subject, and I think we tried to be as specific as we can here in a little under an hour or whatever this was. But enjoyed talking about it. I know we're gonna pick a subject next week and tackle it again, and they're fun conversations to have.
Well, absolutely, and can't thank you enough to the support to such a young podcast show here on Expanding the Zone. Check us out on YouTube if you're listening to us on the podcast version. Check us out on YouTube, SVC Sports Zone Shayne. Gives you a chance to watch some video and maybe get a little bit more of our conversation and see our beautiful faces here. Again, if you're on YouTube, you can also get us on wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, all the way across the board there. You can follow us Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're out there just about everywhere. Again, the SVC Sports Zone that you see here behind me is the easiest way to find us. So on that note, we'll get out of here. A lot of fun. Enjoy the last dance. If you have anything you want to pass along to us, I've certainly enjoyed the feedback on our cheating on episode 2, and I'd certainly love to hear more about what you're thinking of the last dance and how this championship chain can work. So on that note, just help continue to expand the zone, and we appreciate you listening. Thank you.